Tonight, my friends, I want to tell you a story that was whispered through castle walls, where power wasn't only crowned, it was married. And what sealed that marriage wasn't love, but blood. Not the kind shed in war, but something far more personal, something expected, searched for, and displayed like a symbol of honor. In a time when a man's title meant nothing without a wife, and a woman's worth was measured by what happened after her wedding night, this story unfolded quietly, behind velvet curtains and locked wooden doors in a small stone village. Beneath the towering shadow of a northern castle, the people lived by old rules, the kind carved not into law, but into fear. A noble girl named Eleonora had just turned 16, the age where childhood vanished with the turning of a season. Her hair was the color of wheat at harvest, and her silence was often mistaken for obedience. She was promised to Sir Aldrich, a man twice her age, chosen not for charm, but for land, because land was how families survived. And so, on a cold spring evening, when the bell tolled and flowers were pinned into her braid, Eleonora became a bride before she had ever truly been a girl. The ceremony was brief, sacred, and cold, but the real ritual came after. As the couple was led to their chamber, no one smiled. Servants placed clean linen on the bed, watched by a quiet priest and two older women with folded hands and sharp eyes. The bed wasn't just for rest, it was proof. In the morning, that linen would be examined. It was expected to be stained not with wine, not with dirt, but with the sign that Eleonora had been untouched. Until that night, if it wasn't, everything would change, not just for her, but for both families. And as the heavy door closed, she sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, knowing the first pain she would feel in marriage wouldn't be from heartbreak, but from expectation. The room was dimly lit, warmed only by the flicker of a fire that cast long shadows across the stone walls. Eleonora sat motionless, her hands resting on her lap, fingers twisted tightly in the fabric of her dress. The silence was too loud. Outside, the sounds of distant celebration carried faintly through the thick walls, laughter, music, footsteps in the courtyard, but none of it reached her. She could still feel the weight of the priest's gaze as he blessed the chamber, as if holiness itself had been invited to witness something it should not. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, sprinkled on the sheets, but it couldn't mask the metallic coldness of what was to come. Sir Aldrich, now her husband, stood across the room, slowly removing the layers of his ceremonial robe. He did not look at her cruelly, but neither did he look with gentleness. There was a duty in his eyes, the same kind that soldiers wore before entering a battle. He had done this before, perhaps not with the same ritual, but with the same silence. He cleared his throat, as if trying to soften the moment, but no words came. Eleonora didn't expect any. She had heard whispers from older girls in the village, secret things said near wells and inside kitchens, but no whisper had ever prepared her for this silence, this stillness, this fear. She shifted slightly, the mattress creaking beneath her, and the sound felt like a scream. Every gesture, every breath, carried the weight of judgment. She thought about the linen folded neatly at the foot of the bed, waiting like a witness. No one had asked if she wanted to be here. No one had asked if she was ready. The ritual wasn't about her. It wasn't even about Aldrich. It was about proving a transaction had been sealed, that she was pure, and that purity had now been claimed. In that moment, Eleonora felt less like a bride and more like a letter sealed with blood, proof of a promise that wasn't hers to write. As the fire crackled softly, casting its gentle glow across the bed, Eleonora lay down beside a man she barely knew. Her eyes stared up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, tracing the dark lines that curved like roots. The world outside the room no longer mattered, not the prayers, not the banners, not the wine being poured in the hall. Here, only breath and silence remained. When Sir Aldrich reached for her, his touch was neither harsh nor kind, simply expected. Emotion performed not out of desire, but due to. And though he whispered her name, it sounded like someone reading from a script. This wasn't a moment shared. It was a moment watched not by eyes, but by consequences. When it was over, Eleonora turned away, curling into herself beneath the heavy wool blanket. Her body ached not from the act alone, but from the weight of meaning forced upon it. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just waited for morning, for the examination, for judgment. She could already feel the ghost of the linen in her mind. Imagine the hands that would lift it up to the light, looking for stains like one might search for a sign from God. She thought of her mother, who had kissed her forehead before the ceremony, eyes red but lips silent. Had she gone through the same thing? Was this silence passed down, like jewelry or recipes? The fire burned louder now, a quiet rhythm in the background. Eleonora finally closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to disappear. In her mind, she left the chamber and ran through the meadows of her childhood, where no one watched her, where she could fall in the grass and laugh. But even in that dream, something chased her, red cloth blowing in the wind, always following, always reminding, because for women like her, purity wasn't a feeling, it was a performance. And if the curtain failed to fall with the right stain, the audience would not applaud, they would judge, and the girl who failed to bleed could never truly be loved. The morning sun filtered softly through the narrow windows, casting pale gold stripes across the stone floor. The chamber no longer held the hush of night, only the stillness of something that had already happened. Eleonora remained motionless, beneath the covers, pretending to sleep, her body sore and her thoughts tangled. Outside the door, quiet footsteps moved with purpose. The priest would return soon, along with the matrons, and between them, folded in careful hands, would be the linen. It had been taken while she dozed, just as she expected. Her husband had risen early, dressed in silence, and slipped out before the light touched the floor. He did not speak. He did not kiss her forehead. The ritual was done. The door creaked open, and Eleonora's breath froze in her chest. She didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She knew the steps of the women who had prepared the bed the night before, steps that now returned, this time slower, more deliberate. The linen was unfolded on a small table near the hearth, its pale fabric fluttering like a flag caught in an invisible wind. The fire from the night had dimmed to soft embers, and its glow now illuminated what they were looking for. One of the women leaned in, inspecting the cloth, her fingers pressing gently at a dark spot near the edge. A murmur passed between them, low, short, impossible to hear clearly. But Eleonora understood. She kept her eyes closed, still, quiet, like a statue made of flesh. If the stain was there, everything would proceed. Gifts would be exchanged. The marriage would be spoken of proudly. But if it wasn't enough, if there was doubt, questions would begin. She knew what doubt could do. She had seen it turn friends into whispers and mothers into stones. Her future, her reputation, her family's honor, it all lay in the crease of a sheet. And as the women folded the linen again and turned to leave, Eleonora exhaled slowly, feeling her heart return to her chest like something rescued from drowning. Outside the chamber, the household had already begun to stir. Servants moved like ghosts through the corridors, lighting candles, carrying trays, preparing rooms. A wedding night was not just a private matter, it was part of a social contract, one that tied bloodlines, estates, and futures together. And the linen, now quietly carried through the halls in the hands of the priest, was more than just fabric. It was evidence. It would be shown to both families, discreetly but deliberately. A sign that the bride had fulfilled her part, that the groom had claimed what was his. Eleonora, still lying in bed, imagined it all, imagined her father's nod of approval, her mother's quiet cares, the steward's cold satisfaction. Everyone else seemed to know what to feel. She didn't. Eventually, she was helped out of bed, her feet unsteady on the cold stone floor. A maid dressed her slowly in a deep blue gown, tying the laces with gentle hands, as if wrapping up a wound. Eleonora didn't speak. Her mouth was dry, her throat tight. The maid offered her warm water, and for a moment, Eleonora's hands trembled. As she reached for the cup, everything in her body ached, not from pain alone, but from the weight of being looked at, touched, judged. She felt like a figure from a tale, a symbol rather than a person. And yet, no one had ever asked how she felt about any of it. Not once. When she was ready, she was led to the hall where her family waited. Her mother rose to greet her, eyes scanning her daughter's face with something between worry and pride. Her father stood beside the priest, already speaking of arrangements, of gifts, of what lands would change hands now that everything had gone as planned. But behind the formal words, Eleonora saw the truth. They had been afraid, all of them, afraid that she might fail to bleed, afraid that this fragile deal, built on something so invisible, might fall apart. She smiled softly as expected, but inside she wondered, if love had been asked for instead of blood, would anyone still be here? The banquet that followed was filled with laughter and light, but Eleonora felt like a ghost in the middle of it. Plates clattered, goblets clinked, music played from the corner where minstrels strummed gently on their lutes. Everyone seemed relieved, almost cheerful, as if a storm had passed and left the house untouched. She sat beside Audric, now her husband in name and in deed, and listened to nobles toast to their union. No one mentioned the linen directly. They didn't need to. The joy on their faces said everything. The proof had been found. The contract, silent and sacred, had been sealed with a mark no one would ever see again. Yet everyone would remember. Aldrich turned to her now and then, offering polite smiles, refilling her cup, speaking to her as one might speak to a guest, formal, careful, distant. He wasn't unkind. He simply didn't know her, and Eleonora didn't know him. They shared a table, a name, and a room, but they hadn't shared a story. Not yet. She watched as her father raised his glass to Aldrich, his voice proud and firm. To a strong alliance, he declared, and those words echoed louder than any song. That's what this was. After all, not a love story, but a treaty written. In silence, as the banquet stretched into the evening, Eleonora let her gaze drift across the hall. She noticed how other women watched her, some with envy, others with sorrow. Young girls giggled behind veils, wondering what the chamber had been like. Older women exchanged glances, their eyes heavy with memory. She felt all of them pressing against her like invisible hands, measuring her, remembering their own nights of linen and silence. And in that sea of faces, she suddenly understood. This wasn't just her story. It was every woman's. A quiet inheritance passed down through generations. Not of love, not of joy, but of survival in a world where a single stain could build or break her life. Eleonora smiled, just slightly. The fire in her heart hadn't gone out. It had simply learned to burn quietly. In the days that followed, the castle returned to its rhythm, the clanging of metal in the courtyards, the echo of prayers in the chapel, the smell of bread rising from the kitchen hearth. Life resumed, but for Eleonora, everything felt tilted, like the floor beneath her feet had shifted just slightly. She moved through the halls with the grace she had been taught, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, always polite. Yet inside, questions kept blooming like vines, quiet, persistent, impossible to trim. She wondered what the maid had seen. The one who had taken the linen, folded it carefully, and handed it to the priest. Did she glance at the fabric? Did she wince at the red? Or was she so used to it that it had become nothing at all? The maid's name was Caris. She was quiet, quick, and often moved like smoke, always present, yet never noticed. But Eleonora began to watch her, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. There was something in the girl's eyes that suggested she carried stories no one had ever asked her to tell. She moved through chambers others avoided, and she often lingered near the walls when people spoke, catching fragments of power in whispered form. One afternoon, while Eleonora sat alone in the window seat, staring at the gardens below, Caris approached without a word and placed a small tray beside her. Bread, honey, a cup of warm clove water, and just before she turned to leave, she paused. You don't have to smile so much, Caris said, barely above a whisper. No one smiles for you. Eleonora blinked. She hadn't realized she was smiling. It had become reflex, the curve of the lips that meant safety, acceptance, peace. But Caris had seen through it. For a moment, they looked at each other. Two women caught in the same story, but reading it from different pages. And then Caris was gone, swallowed by the corridor's silence. But her words remained, like a crack in a wall Eleonora hadn't noticed before. Small, barely visible, but once seen, impossible to forget. That night, Eleonora lay awake in the silence of her chamber, listening not to the wind or footsteps in the hall, but to the echo of Caris's words. No one smiles for you. It wasn't an insult. It was something softer, almost a kindness, but one dipped in truth. She turned toward the fire, watching how the flames rose and fell in rhythm, their shadows flickering across the stone walls like dancers from another world. The room felt colder than before, even with the embers still glowing. Her bed, once dressed in lace and silks, now felt like a stage, and she, the actress, had forgotten where her performance ended and her real voice began. She sat up slowly, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and walked barefoot toward the hearth. The cold of the floor met the warmth of the fire in strange harmony. She crouched beside it, as if the flame might whisper something back. All her life, Eleonora had been taught how to behave, how to walk, how to speak, how to laugh without showing too much joy, how to lower her eyes without seeming weak. But no one had ever taught her how to feel, only how to appear. And now, in the quiet of a marriage, no one asked her to want. She began to wonder if her entire life had been one long rehearsal for a role she never chose. As the fire cracked gently, she remembered being a child, hiding beneath the table during council meetings, drawing on scraps of parchment while her father made decisions that shaped entire villages. Back then, no one paid her any mind, and in that invisibility, she had been free. But now, with every eye trained on her as bride, as lady, as proof, she felt more invisible than ever. Not because she was ignored, but because she was only seen as what others wanted her to be. Carys had seen something different. She had seen her, and that quiet recognition, that flash of shared knowing between women, it stirred something Eleanor hadn't felt in years, her own story, waiting to begin. The next morning brought no grand revelations, no sudden change, only the soft, persistent rhythm of another day in the castle. But something had shifted, even if it was only inside Eleanor. She moved slower, not from fatigue, but from thought. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way Carys avoided certain corridors, how Lady Brenner always adjusted her veil before entering a room, the quiet glances exchanged between servants when certain names were spoken aloud. The castle was no longer just a home or a prison, it was a stage, and everyone played a part. But behind those roles were real people, carrying their own hidden hopes, hurts, and histories. Eleanor had only just begun to listen that afternoon. She asked for a walk in the garden. It wasn't unusual brides were expected to be seen to smile, to stroll with grace. But when Aldrich joined her, as custom required, something different passed between them. They walked slowly through the hedge paths, saying little there, steps soft against the gravel. And then, without looking at her, Aldrich said, "They brought me the linen too, you know." Eleanor's breath caught, but she kept walking. He continued, "They placed it in my hands like a trophy, like a deed of ownership. I didn't want it." Eleanor turned her face toward him, unsure if she'd heard correctly. He wasn't looking for her reaction, just releasing something long held. "I don't know what you expected of me," he added quietly, "but I only know how to be what I've been told. Just like you." The garden was silent, except for the breeze moving through the leaves. For the first time, she didn't see Aldrich as a stranger behind a title. She saw a young man trapped in another version of the same play. Maybe he hadn't chosen this marriage either. Maybe he too was learning his lines by heart. And in that small shared truth, in that quiet confession by the roses, Eleanor felt something shift again. Not love, not yet, but understanding. And sometimes that's where love begins. Days slipped into one another like pages in an old book, their corners worn, their stories half remembered. In the quiet rhythm of the castle, Eleanor began to see that truth did not live in the loudest voices or the grandest halls, but in the in-between spaces, in the way Carys paused before speaking, in how Aldrich's eyes followed the sky at dusk, as if chasing something that once made sense. The castle, once rigid in its rituals, now felt alive with whispers. They floated behind curtains, between walls, under footsteps. Eleanor found herself drawn to them, to the soft sounds no one else seemed to hear. Secrets not shouted but offered, like open hands in the dark. One evening, as the sun melted behind the western towers, she wandered into the old music room. It hadn't been used in years. Dust lined the windowsills, and one of the harps was missing a string. She sat down at the old wooden bench near the tall stained glass window and ran her fingers along the keys of the clavichord. It didn't sing the way it used to, but the sound it made was honest raw, slightly broken, and entirely hers. Behind her, she heard footsteps, not loud. Careful, she didn't turn. "I used to hide here," said Carys's voice, gentle as ever. "When I was a child, before they made me a maid." Eleanor nodded. She understood. "It's the only room where no one pretends," she replied. They sat in silence for a while. No need for explanation. Two women from different worlds, with more in common than the rules around them would allow. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She just let the moment be, and in that stillness, a kind of truth bloomed, not one made for display or woven into tapestries, but one passed hand to hand, through glances, through breath. It was not the kind of truth the church sought on blood-stained linens. It was deeper, and Eleanor felt it settle into her chest like warmth from the fire. Quiet, undeniable, her own. Later that week, an invitation arrived, not on parchment, but in the form of a passing remark from Lady Brenner, one of the older matrons of the house. "You're expected at the Chamber of Instruction," she said, her tone light, but her eyes weighed with meaning. Eleanor had heard whispers of that room. It wasn't on any map of the castle, nor spoken of in open conversation. Only the married women knew, only those who had bled, proven, and survived. When she asked where it was, Lady Brenner smiled thinly and simply said, "You'll be guided." That night, a maid appeared, not Carys, and led her silently through corridors she hadn't walked before, deeper into the stone belly of the keep. past faded tapestries and locked iron doors. The room itself was warm, lit by dozens of low candles. It smelled of dried herbs, old wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside were 3 other women, all older, dressed in modest gowns of dark blue. They welcomed her not with greetings, but with nods, as if she had passed a threshold that required no ceremony. One of them, a woman with silver streaks in her braid, gestured for her to sit on the cushioned bench. "This is where we speak truth," she said. "Not the truth of kings or priests, but the truth we live with." Eleanor didn't speak at first. She simply listened. They told stories soft, steady, and deeply personal. Of wedding nights turned cold, of love that never came, of sons who looked like men they never loved. They spoke not to instruct, but to remember. Each story layered the room with a kind of sacred silence, like prayers not to God, but to each other. Eleanor felt her breath slow, her shoulders drop. For the first time, she felt no eyes watching to judge, only to witness. And in that moment, she understood why the room had no name. It didn't need one. It was not built for records, but for healing, for truth that could only survive when spoken low, between women, by candlelight. When Eleanor left the chamber that night, the castle felt different beneath her feet, not smaller, not larger, but somehow more alive. The walls she had once passed blindly now seemed to lean in, listening. She returned to her chamber in silence, her fingers brushing the cold stone as she walked. No one spoke of what happened in that hidden room. No one needed to, but something had been offered to her, not knowledge in the way books teach, but wisdom carved from breath, pain, and time, the kind that women carry silently, passing it not through ink but through presence. And Eleanor felt its weight inside her, not as a burden, but as something grounding, something real. As she slipped back into bed, the fire nearly out, she realized how many stories lived in silence. Not only hers, not only Caris's or Audric's, but generations of women who had smiled through ceremonies, held their tongues at supper, cried without sound behind locked doors. And now, she knew where some of those stories went. Not lost, not erased, but stored in the warmth of candlelit confession, guarded by women who had learned to keep each other alive through memory. That room had no altar, yet it had given her more faith than any chapel. The moonlight came through the window in silver ribbons, catching the tips of her fingers as she lay still. She thought of Audric, his quiet honesty in the garden, of loneliness in his eyes, and she thought of Caris, of her bold whisper, of the way she moved like she knew more than she said. Eleanor didn't have answers yet. She still didn't know what kind of woman she would become in this life she had chosen. But for the first time, she had a thread to follow, a place to begin, not with duty, not with ritual, but with listening, with noticing, with truth. And that night, as she closed her eyes, the silence wasn't heavy. It was soft, like breath, like the start of a story not yet told, but finally, quietly, hers. The first rain in weeks came quietly, soft as breath against the windows. It washed the castle in a silver light, made the stones glisten like they were breathing. Eleanor awoke to the rhythm of it, not startled, soothed. The world beyond her chamber seemed gentler, hushed by the sky's long-awaited weeping. She rose slowly, her feet warm on the rug, and pulled her shawl close around her shoulders. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving only the scent of burnt cedar behind. There was no summons at her door, no one waiting with tasks or instructions. For once, the day was hers to meet alone. She wandered down one of the older hallways, the ones the servants rarely entered. Dust coated the corners, and time had softened the edges of every tapestry. These walls didn't carry power anymore, only memory. At the far end, she found a narrow door left slightly open. Inside was a small study, unused, forgotten, but still holding the scent of ink and parchment. Curiosity pulled her in. She moved slowly, as though the air itself asked her to tread gently. On the desk sat a bundle of old letters, bound by faded blue ribbon. She hesitated. They weren't addressed to her, but the seal was broken, the ribbon frayed. She untied it. The first letter was written in a hand unlike any she recognized. Sharp, yet tired. It wasn't poetry, nor record. It was confession. A woman's voice, speaking across time. They said love would come after duty, it began. But what if it doesn't? What if the bed stays cold, even when the sheets are warm with proof? Eleanor read on. Her breath caught somewhere between the lines. The woman spoke of longing, of loneliness, of moments stolen in shadows, a love never named, a hunger never soothed. It was not scandal. It was sorrow. Pure, raw, honest sorrow, and as Eleonora's fingers trembled over the parchment, she felt as if she were reading her own heart, written by someone who had lived and vanished long before her, someone who had whispered into silence and hoped it would echo. Eleonora folded the letter with care, almost afraid the paper might sigh beneath her touch. She didn't know who had written it. There was no name, no date, only the weight of the words, as if the writer had not expected to be remembered, only to be heard. She placed it back in the bundle, but did not tie the ribbon again. Instead, she sat in the old chair beside the window, where the rain continued its soft tapping. For a long moment, she just sat. The castle no longer felt like a stranger to her. It felt like a breathing thing, a keeper of last voices, of truths not fit for ceremony, but too sacred to be buried. She looked around the study and wondered how many women had passed through this place. How many had sat in this very chair, hiding their hearts in folded pages. Perhaps they hadn't vanished, perhaps they had just gone quiet, waiting for someone to listen. Eleonora wasn't sure what drew her next, the desk drawer, half open, or the sense that something remained unfinished. Inside, beneath a layer of old petals and yellowing parchment, was another letter. This one was different. The handwriting was softer, the ink faded, and it was signed, "For the one who comes after me." She read it with trembling hands. It wasn't about sorrow this time, it was a letter of guidance, a gentle voice telling her, "Your heart will be pulled in many directions. They will ask you to wear silence like a crown. But remember, even quiet things have weight." The words settled into Eleonora like warmth. They didn't give answers, only permission to feel, to question, to choose. And in a world that praised obedience more than truth, that was the rarest gift of all. She held the letter to her chest, as if it could steady her heartbeat. Outside, the rain softened into mist, and inside her, something anchored, not rebellion, not defiance, just a quiet, unshakable knowing. She was not the first to carry this burden, and she would not be the last. That night, long after the candles had burned low and the halls had returned to their familiar hush, Eleonora laid awake beneath the canopy of her bed, the letter still resting beneath her pillow. It wasn't the words themselves that kept her eyes from closing, but the feeling they left behind, like standing on the edge of something vast and unnamed. She stared at the shadows on the ceiling, watching them shift with the soft flicker of the dying fire. All around her, the world slept in rules and routines, but inside her, something stirred, not loud, not clear, but awake. She thought of the maid who had shown her kindness without permission, of Aldrich, who wore his restraint-like armor, of the women in the candlelit chamber, speaking their truths as if naming them gave them breath. And she thought of the unknown woman who had written the letter not to be remembered, but to make sure someone else would feel less alone. It was a kind of legacy that couldn't be measured by titles or heirs. A legacy made of feeling, of connection, of courage passed hand to hand in silence. Somewhere between thought and stillness, Eleonora whispered to herself, "I won't forget, not just the words, but what they allowed her to see, that even in a life shaped by duty, there could be softness and choice and meaning, that maybe the bravest thing a woman could do wasn't to fight loudly, but to carry her truth gently through the spaces where no one expected it to survive." With that thought, her eyes finally closed. The room grew quiet again, and in the distance, the rain began to fall once more, steady, soft, like a lullaby only the walls could hear. Somewhere in the castle, the letter still waited in the drawer, and somewhere inside Eleonora, a door had opened that would never fully close again. The morning came with no sun, just a pale, pearl-grey sky stretching silently over the towers, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Eleonora was awakened by the soft knock of her maid. Not Carrie's, but a younger girl she didn't know well. The girl didn't speak, only left a folded dress at the edge of the bed, ivory silk, finely stitched, with a long veil tucked beside it. Eleonora sat up slowly. She had not been told it would be today. There had been no announcement, no ceremony rehearsed, and yet the message was clear. The dress was not a question, it was a sentence. She dressed without help, her hands steady, but cold. The veil brushed her shoulders like a whisper of something she hadn't chosen. In the mirror, she barely recognized the girl staring back, not because she looked different, but because something in her eyes had grown quiet. Not broken, not afraid, just distant, like she had stepped behind a wall of glass and was watching it all happen from the other side. As she moved through the halls, people nodded, some smiled, none looked her directly in the eyes. They didn't have to. This day wasn't about her, It was about proof, about lineage, about sealing a pact written long before her birth. The ceremony itself was brief, a few words spoken by the priest, 2 rings exchanged beneath a carved arch, and a single kiss placed carefully on her cheek. Aldrich looked at her with the same gentle sadness he always had, but said nothing beyond the vows. His hands were warm, his posture respectful, but Eleanor could feel the weight in the silence between them. It was not love, it was duty worn like silk, stitched tightly over hearts that had never been asked what they wanted. As the guests applauded with polite reserve, Eleanor stood beside him, smiling as expected, but inside, her thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the letters, to the chamber of women, to the truths hidden beneath silk and stone, and to the night ahead, which everyone whispered about, but no one dared explain. The bed was dressed in white linen, perfectly pressed, with a single silver candlestick burning at its side. Petals had been scattered with precision, not passion red and pink, arranged more like a display than a celebration. Eleanor stood at the threshold, still wrapped in ceremony, her veil folded neatly over her arm. Aldrich sat in the chair by the fire, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. He looked like a statue carved from worry, not desire. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was too old for that. It felt rehearsed, like something inherited rather than created. I suppose we're expected, he said quietly, not looking at her. She didn't answer, only moved to sit on the edge of the bed. The room didn't feel like hers. It didn't feel like his. It felt like a stage built for an audience they couldn't see. Because somewhere, they both knew they weren't alone, though no footsteps echoed in the corridor, and no voices whispered behind the walls. The presence of others lingered, witnesses not of love, but of confirmation. In some courts, it was tradition for elders to remain just beyond the door, waiting for proof. A sheet, a stain, a story that could be passed along in whispers and nods. Aldrich finally stood and moved to her slowly, like someone stepping onto ice. He didn't reach for her. He simply sat beside her, hands folded, eyes still on the candlelight. They want us to be something we're not, he said, voice barely above breath. But I won't hurt you to make them believe it. His words settled like soft cloth over a wound she hadn't known was open. She turned to him, not with fear, but with something close to gratitude. In that moment, they were no longer strangers bound by title. They were just 2 people trapped in the same story, trying to write a single honest line. Outside, the night pressed close to the windows. Inside, they waited not for permission, not for proof, but for the silence to pass without breaking. Either of them, the candle burned low, casting soft shadows across the chamber walls, and still neither of them moved. Time seemed to stretch in that quiet, not as something to be filled, but something to be felt breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. Eleanor leaned back slowly, resting against the headboard, her hands folded in her lap. Aldrich remained seated on the edge of the bed, his eyes drifting toward the window where the moon hung heavy behind a thin veil of clouds. No words were needed. In the silence, there was a kind of pact forming not of passion or romance, but of understanding, of care chosen in the absence of desire, of gentleness offered when the world demanded spectacle. Then, softly, Eleanor spoke. Do you think they'll ask? Her voice was not bitter, only tired. Aldrich gave a quiet nod. They won't ask. They'll assume. That's all they've ever done. A pause followed, long and weightless. Then, in the hush between them, he added, but I won't let them turn your body into a report. The words didn't shock her. They settled like warm cloth, not dramatic, not defiant, just real. And in that honesty, something in her chest loosened. She realized how little she had expected kindness, and how precious it became when offered without price. They agreed, without ever truly saying it, to leave the bed unslept, to let the sheets remain untouched, the silence unbroken. Instead, Aldrich placed a folded blanket near the hearth, where he lay down with one hand tucked beneath his head, the other resting on his chest. Eleanor remained in bed, her thoughts drifting like slow-moving clouds, and as the candle finally extinguished itself, the room dimmed into a velvet quiet. Outside, no one cheered, no one watched, but for the first time, the silence did not feel like judgment. It felt like freedom, not loud, not grand, just quiet and shared. And perhaps, for 2 people forced into a story not of their making, that was its own kind of love. Morning light slipped quietly through the narrow windows, painting the stone floor in long, golden streaks. Eleanor sat at the dressing table, her hair unbraided, her face bare, watching herself without expression. The night had passed no parade, no proof, no announcement. And yet, the castle breathed differently. Not louder, just sharper, like it knew something it wasn't ready to say aloud. She could feel it in the way the maids moved, glancing quickly, stepping lighter, in the way the steward bowed a little deeper, but did not meet her eyes, and in the stillness of Aldrich, who had already gone by the time she awoke, leaving only the faint scent of smoke from his place by the hearth. It was not disappointment. They feared it was disruption, the kind that could not be punished, but also could not be ignored. There was no blood-stained sheet, no whispered confirmation passed between servants. Just silence, and silence was a language everyone in the castle had learned to speak fluently. Eleonora rose from her chair and walked the corridors alone, her steps echoing gently against the stone. The walls, old and patient, seemed to watch her, not with accusation, but with memory. They had seen brides before. They had held secrets, and they had learned never to speak them out loud. At the far end of the hall, she paused before the tapestry chamber. Inside, older women gathered in clusters, their hands busy with thread, their mouths busy with stories. It was not the fabric they wove that held power, but the glances, the pauses, the sudden hush when she entered. Eleonora did not flinch. She met their eyes and nodded politely, then walked on. The stories would come twisted, softened, reshaped to fit the needs of tradition, but she would not chase them down, nor try to correct what the walls had already begun to echo. She was learning slowly that in places like these, what didn't happen could matter more than what did. And sometimes, the quietest defiance was simply to remain standing. Later that day, a summons arrived. A sealed parchment, carried not by a servant, but by a messenger in the crest of the church. The seal was unbroken, but the meaning was clear. Someone had whispered. Eleonora unfolded the parchment alone in the small library at the eastern wing, a quiet place filled with dust, forgotten scrolls, and windows that opened only to the gardens. The letter was polite, almost warm, a request for a conversation, but beneath the calligraphy, she could read the real message. Explain yourself. Not in those words, of course. The church never asked so directly. It simply invited, and expected, the fear of refusal to do the rest. She held the letter for a long moment before folding it again. Then she looked out through the narrow window. Below in the courtyard, children of the lower servants were chasing each other with sticks, laughing without care. In that moment, something inside her softened and hardened at once, a strange blend of calm and resolve. She was tired of answering for things that were never hers to choose, tired of being watched and measured like fabric to be cut and fitted, and most of all, she was tired of fear pretending to be reverence when she met Aldrich again. Later that evening, she told him about the letter. He was quiet, of course, thoughtful. Then he said, "You don't have to go." But she only smiled. "I do," she replied, "but not for them. For me." She wasn't seeking permission. She wasn't even preparing to explain. She simply wanted to sit in the room where judgment waited, and not flinch. Aldrich reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. There was no strategy left to protect, only presence, only choice. And in that quiet moment, where two people simply saw each other without expectation, Eleonora felt stronger than any title could make her. Not powerful in the way kings were, but powerful in the way silence becomes a song no one can unhear once it's begun. The chapel chamber was colder than the rest of the castle. Its walls, high and narrow, seemed to lean inward like witnesses, carved with saints who had seen too much. Eleonora stepped in alone. No guards, no escort, just the soft echo of her footsteps on the stone floor. At the far end of the room, beneath a tall stained glass window, sat Father Brivin, a man known more for his silence than his sermons. His robes were simple, his eyes not unkind. He gestured for her to sit. She did, and for a long moment, neither spoke. When he finally did, his voice was louder than she expected. There have been uncertainties. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the words hover, like incense smoke between them. Eleonora met his gaze and tilted her head slightly. "Then let them remain so," she said. Her tone was not sharp. It was steady, almost tender, the voice of someone who had walked through fire and realized she no longer owed the flames an explanation. Father Brevin studied her, not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. Then he nodded once slowly, as if the answer had surprised him in its simplicity. "You do not fear judgment?" he asked. She smiled, but it didn't reach. Her eyes, "I've already lived inside it." That was all she offered, and that was all he seemed to need. There was no interrogation, no demand for evidence, Just silence and then the sound of parchment being folded and tucked away. As she stood to leave, he said, "You are." "Not what I expected." She turned back, her hand resting lightly on the wooden doorframe. "Neither was I," she replied. And with that, she stepped back into the corridor where the sun was beginning to set through the narrow windows. It poured in softly, golden and indifferent, lighting her path not as a blessing, but as a recognition. She did not walk away as a bride, nor as a rebel. She walked as something harder to name and much harder to silence. The days that followed moved quietly, as if the castle itself were holding its breath. No proclamations were made, no punishments given, but the air had shifted. Eleonora returned to her daily walks, her silent meals, her slow evenings reading, by candlelight. But something inside her had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but entirely. The girl who had once stepped through the castle gates with wide eyes and folded hands was gone. In her place was a woman who no longer bent under the weight of expectation. She hadn't shattered it, she had simply outlasted it. And that, in a world like hers, was a far rarer victory. The servants still bowed, but with something gentler in their movements, not just duty, but quiet respect. The older maids, the ones who whispered over embroidery and dried herbs, now fell silent when she passed. Not out of malice, but out of care. Because Eleonora had not played the game, and she had not lost it. She had stepped out of it entirely, and somehow remained whole. Aldrich saw it too, in the way he looked at her now, not with the discomfort of a husband unsure, but the stillness of a man who had seen something sacred and chosen not to touch it. One evening, near the end of the harvest season, he found her in the small garden, near the northern wall, the one with the twisted pear trees and the uneven stone bench. He didn't say much, just sat beside her as the wind stirred the leaves into gentle applause. After a while, he said, "They're still waiting for a story." She looked at him, then smiled faintly. "Then let them write their own that night." No one watched the windows, no one checked the bed, and yet something real had passed between them, not a romance, not a performance, but an understanding. Quiet, rooted, alive, in a world that judged worth by display. Eleonora had become something far more difficult to measure, a presence that would linger long after the names were forgotten. In the years that followed, the castle changed hands more than once. New flags were raised, new names etched into the ledgers. The walls were repaired, the chapel repainted, and the servants replaced. But the garden by the northern wall remained untouched, its bare trees still bending gently toward the earth, its stone bench still worn smooth by time. Visitors came and went, marveling at the tapestries and armor, asking about kings and battles and ancient noble lines. But sometimes, someone would stop by that quiet corner and ask, almost in passing, who was the woman who planted these trees? And the answer, if it came at all, was always a little different. A name half remembered, a marriage barely recorded, a silence that had somehow become part of the architecture itself. Eleonora was not carved into the stone. Her name was not sung in the chapel or painted beside saints, but those who had lived beside her, even briefly, carried her in small gestures, in the way they paused before speaking, or left a seat empty without knowing why. Some said she had written letters, folded carefully and hidden between pages of forgotten books in the castle library. Others claimed she had once spoken a blessing over a young maid, who later married for love, a scandal in itself. But no one ever found proof, and perhaps that was the point. Her life had not been preserved through power. It had been remembered through presence, through the echo of someone who had dared to exist fully, in a place designed to erase. The church never asked again. The nobles found other stories to believe, and the silence around Eleonora became its own kind of legend, not the kind told loudly in feasts, but the kind whispered between candle flames when the wind pressed against old windows. The kind that made people wonder, just for a second, what courage might feel like when it doesn't shout, but simply stands still. And in that stillness, something enduring remained, not a tale of rebellion, but of quiet, deliberate freedom. Long after Eleonora's name faded from the household records, and even the descendants of Aldrich could no longer recall her face clearly, something of her lingered. Not in portraits, there were none, not in poetry. No verses bore her name, but in the way time seemed to slow near the northern wall, in how the pear trees bloomed just a little earlier there, and the wind carried a softer hush. Some claimed it was coincidence, others believed it was simply the way gardens aged. But a few quiet women, older caretakers, Visiting scholars with worn boots and careful eyes felt it differently. They would pause on that bench, close their eyes, and say nothing. But when they opened them again, they always looked calmer, as if they'd been reminded of something they didn't know they had forgotten over time. Young brides would walk those same halls, dressed in lace and fear, wondering if they'd ever feel like themselves again. And sometimes, the older maids would whisper a name not with reverence, but with warmth. "Eleonora walked here once," they'd say, tucking in a strand of hair, straightening a veil. And she didn't run, that was the lesson. Not in escaping, not in shouting, but in staying fully present, fully awake, in a place designed to make you disappear. And because one woman had done it, quietly, others found the courage to try so tonight. My friends, if you find yourself walking the corridors of your own life, unsure, unseen, or unloved, remember her. Remember the girl who refused to perform, who answered questions with silence and expectations with stillness, who sat on a garden bench when no one was watching and chose to belong to herself. She did not win a war. She did not start one. But she changed something more lasting. She changed what the walls remembered. And sometimes that is how legacies truly begin, not with triumph or tragedy, but with someone who simply stays until the silence finally turns into story.